Hello, Tubby and Coos fans. It's me, Candace, back at you again, this time from my house for another author event. I am super excited to be here today. I know I always say that, but I'm always excited to have authors here on our book stream. And so today we have a conversation between two tour authors. And as anyone who has ever come into my store knows, we are tour stands here. So I'm really excited for this today. So the first author is Brian Staveley. He has taught literature, religion, history, and philosophy and holds an MA in poetry from Boston University. His books, which have been translated into over a dozen languages, include The Emperor's Blades, The Providence of Fire, The Last Mortal Bond, and Skullsworn, which is just a really cool title. He lives in Vermont and divides his time between running trails, splitting wood, writing, and chasing his son downhill on a mountain bike, which all sounds like a lot of fun. His most recent fantasy novel is called The Empire's Ruin, and that has just been released from tour. And he will be in conversation with Ryan Van Loan, who is an up-and-coming science fiction and fantasy author who discovered his love of genre fiction at a young age through the works of Robin McKinley, Robert Jordan, Stephen King, and many more, as I'm sure a lot of you did too. Ryan spent 6 years as a sergeant in the United States Army Infantry, PA National Guard, where he served on the front lines in Afghanistan. He's traveled around the world with his wife, wandering Caribbean island haunts, exploring the palaces and cathedrals of Europe, and hiking with elephants in the rainforest of Southeast Asia, and literally has a life that I wish I had because that all sounds amazing. Ryan's debut novel was The Sin and the Steel, and it was the first book in the Fall of God series. The Justice and Revenge is the second book, and I believe that's the newest one that has just come out. So today, Ryan lives in northeastern Pennsylvania with his wife and 2 dogs, and he is hard at work on his next novel. So welcome to Brian and Ryan. It rhymes.
There we go. Yeah.
Love it.
And
thanks for having us, Candace.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And I'm really excited to listen to y'all talk.
All right. Brian, who should kick it off? Should we do a coin flip or what? I mean,
well, so I mentioned that I did a background check on you before we got started. And I'm curious if this is true or not. Max said you spent some time in Thailand. Is that true?
I did. That's very true. In fact, I wrote the first draft of The Emperor's Blades, my first book, over in all in Southeast Asia. So Thailand, Laos, Cambodia. Yeah, I took a year off from my teaching job. I was a high school teacher at the time, and just moved over there and was like, I'm going to try and write a book, and saved up some money and was like, and went for it. So when I heard about you traveling around just now on the introduction, I was like, oh yeah. That's amazing. I love that part of the world. What were you were traveling around there with your wife, I guess?
Yeah, we spent about 3 weeks in Thailand. Yeah, we started up in the north in Chiang Mai.
Yeah, I lived there for a month. Yeah.
Oh, love Chiang Mai. Should have stayed there longer actually. And then we went down south. We were in outside of Phuket in Kata Beach for a while. Yeah. Yeah, just got to explore. Got close to the Laos border there. I'd love to go to Laos. Like we've been.
Oh, I loved it there. Yeah,
back, but you know,
I mean, there's so much. Each of those those countries are so geographically small, and in a way they all share some things, but in a way they're all just like so incredibly distinct that you know, it's like the countries in Europe, right? It's just you go over the border from Switzerland to France, and then from France to Italy. You know, they're all kind of. Yeah, I love that part of the world. So it's like actually like a very smooth lead in, because one of the things, so just for people watching, you know, I've read maybe the first, I think 6 chapters of Ryan's first book, which actually has given me like, it's a very exciting book, The Sin and the Steel. And I have like a million, I'm glad I didn't read the whole book because we would be here all night. But like, I'm curious on the subject of real world places that we've been, and then your world, what kind of stuff from our world, our geography, were you drawing on? Because I see a little bit of stuff that reminds me of kind of like Venetian stuff, and then I see some stuff that seems sort of Caribbean to me. And so I'm curious what influences went into this world building for you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, you're exactly right. So I lived in Puerto Rico as a child for a couple of years.
Okay.
We go back all the time, although, you know, with COVID and stuff, we haven't been back in a little while. So love the Caribbean, growing up there. And then like, I've always been a history buff from the time I learned how to read. So, you know, wanted to study about Puerto Rico, and then that led to pirates. So, you know, from early on, I was reading like Treasure Island and
of course.
And then, you know, Venice has always been a fascinating city for me. I haven't been there yet. Actually, I haven't been to Italy at all. I've been mostly in the western part of Europe, but absolutely love Venice. And really, you know, for me in history, it's like those meeting points, those jumping off points, those melting pots of different cultures. So the Mediterranean, the Caribbean's another example, have always been really fascinating for me. And so when I set out to write this one, those were two places that I gravitated towards. And those are two places that, you know, there's definitely fantasy out there in those areas for sure. You know, Scott Lynch has some Mediterranean.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
We're seeing more Caribbean inspired fantasy, but there hadn't been a lot. And so I was excited to try something that I hadn't seen a lot of. So yeah, I mean, both of those definitely influenced me quite a bit.
I mean, it's cool because the setup, you know, I was chatting with my mom and my girlfriend at dinner about this. And the setup for your book involves, you know, these companies and the projection of economic power, which is not unheard of, again, in fantasy. Like, I mean, I feel like we're living in a golden age of fantasy where people are mining all of these rich veins, but it's not like straight up the middle. I was like, oh, it's exciting to see that we're dealing with like kind of an East India Company as one of the major political forces, instead of like kind of, well, there's this kingdom and there's this kingdom and there's a republic over here, but you have these economic entities that are shouldering up against political entities. And I'm, like I said, I'm early days in the book, but how'd you decide that you wanted to go that direction?
Yeah, well, you know, I'm a heavy outliner, but my characters are all organic, and I don't start a book until basically a character voice just pops into my head. So Buck's voice popped into my head, actually, like woke me up out of a dream, which has never happened before. But she woke me up with one of her lines. It was something about like, let a man think you weak and he won't see the blade until it's between his
yeah. I read that. That's in the early chapters. Yeah,
and that was literally like the line just popped into my head. And with it came this voice, and I got the sense of like pirates and the Caribbean right off, and then some of the other things started to come in. And then as I thought about it more, it's like, okay, we're dealing with Age of Sail. If we're talking about Age of Sail, we're also talking about Age of Mercantilism.
Yeah.
And you're right. We don't necessarily see a lot of that in fantasy. I think we see kind of the equivalent sometimes in like science fiction and space opera and stuff like that.
That is exactly what came out of my conversation tonight. Yeah, totally.
But we don't see a lot of it in fantasy. So
no, I don't think
I was excited about that. And then I was excited about this idea of like this young, you know, street rat who's kind of like a Sherlock Holmes, young Indiana Jones type, but, you know, gender swapped with like a female lead. And so that was kind of my intro into the world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that was another thing. So I was saying, hey, this book is, I was just kind of excited. I was like, this book is really unusual. One, we've got this like mercantile aspect that, you know, there's like a stock market in the world. There's shareholders. That's something you share with Max, actually. You know, Max's books have Max Gladstone, another fantasy writer, great writer who does some really, really interesting and unusual stuff. But then I was like, there's also like the main characters seem to be private investigators, which is just a fucking rad thing you don't run into a lot in fantasy. You know, there's a lot of hard bitten mercenaries and knights and soldiers and mages and this and that, but like kind of a private investigator. I don't know. I mean, maybe I can't tell from your face whether I'm reading that correctly, but it does.
Oh, no. You totally are. You totally are.
So that I was like, oh, this is like private investigator fantasy. Yes, please. That's right.
Yeah. So I think, you know, I wrote a lot of books before I got an agent and before I got published. And so I think the reason why this one isn't, you know, necessarily maybe just an homage to, you know, some of the common elements of fantasy is because I had written kind of those out of my system.
Yeah.
Like this was like my 7th book. So,
oh wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So I had written quite a bit before then.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't know as a debut if that serves you well or not. I think that like I struck a chord with readers, but I also think that sometimes it can be a little hard to market that versus like you know, all the things you just listed, like knights and like kind of more classic fantasy.
Oh no, man, I don't think so. I think right now no, I think this is like exciting and new and original. Like, I don't know. I mean, you can do anything well. I'm not saying I won't read a book about knights. Obviously, there's plenty of great writers doing that kind of stuff. But I think it's exciting when you can get something where you're like, the whole conceit is a little bit different. You know, the whole conceit is shifted, you know, a couple degrees on the compass. That's just, I think that's great for a debut. I think that's exciting.
No, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I've been really excited with it. The second book is definitely much more. It's back in like the more city-state Venetian type feel.
Yeah, yeah.
There's like more boardroom kind of politics and intrigue. So first one definitely like adventure, fantasy, swashbuckling, like all good fun stuff. Second one still fun stuff, slightly different flavor for sure.
Sure. So is this gonna be a trilogy or what's the plan?
Yep. So it's a trilogy. It's all written. Next one comes out next summer. The Memory and the Blood. And I'm pitching my next series to tour and hopefully just tour, but tour and others later this summer. So
you're making me feel bad about myself that like the next one's already written. I'm like,
so I was gonna ask you with this new book. Did you know that like when did you know that? Did you know that when you set out to write the trilogy that you had another trilogy coming up, or like was it when you were finishing? Like I know for me, when I finish a book, that's when I start to get ideas about like the next thing I want to write. But like when did you know like I'm coming back here and this is where I'm picking up?
I knew I was going to come back to the world. You know, it's such a it's so big, and there were ideas, there were locations, there were elements of the history and mythology, religion. All of which are mentioned in my first trilogy that I didn't really explore. And so I always knew that there was, I mean, that's the great thing about fantasy. You create your own world. There's infinite stories that can be told within the scope of the world. But I knew that there was some more stuff that I wanted to do there. Some things that had gone unexploited, and some characters I wanted to follow up with, some elements of the world. So yeah, but I didn't know what the story was going to be. And it took me a long, I mean, I thought I wanted to write like kind of a cool, it sounds like kind of what your first book, The Sin and the Steel, was. Like, it looks just from the maps in the beginning and from the setup in the first 5 chapters, like they're going to go on like an ocean voyage and go to several different places and have like a cool adventure. I was like, I'm going to write a book like that. And then it just wouldn't, I just couldn't do it. You know, I wanted to write a book about these special forces people who were going to go on a mission and, you know, encounter some setbacks, but like basically it would be episodic, and they would triumph in each episode and then they would win. Right. And then I wrote a book where half of them get killed in the first chapter. So I was like, fuck, that's not where, you know, but I tried to write that other book, and I wrote, you know, chapter after chapter. I mean, I wrote them a long way into their voyage, and it was just like, this is boring. This is just boring as hell. These are just people who are good at what they do, and they're doing it. And there's a certain kind of satisfaction reading those books. I recognize that satisfaction, but it was not intriguing to me to write that book. So I had to go back to the starting line. Are you
a discovery writer? Are you writing as you go, kind of learning as you go?
Yeah, unfortunately. God, I wish I was somebody who plotted well and had the outline and knew it was going to happen. But I'm like, I write a chapter and it either feels honest or it doesn't. And unfortunately, more often than not, it doesn't feel honest. And then I'm like, shit, I have to rewrite that chapter or that whole plot line or that whole book, depending on how badly it's gone wrong.
Well, I mean, I think we're all discovery writers, right? Like, you know, to create the outline, you have to tell yourself the story. And I was a discovery writer when I first started writing, but I hate revision. I do it, and it definitely makes the book better, but I hate it. So like for me, it was like, how can I do the least amount of revision as possible? Well, the way is to like give myself a very detailed story map, which is actually super painful. That takes the longest. It takes me longer to outline than it takes me to write the book.
Does it really? So can you put some numbers to that? Like what's the outline versus book writing?
So, okay. So for the memory and the blood, the one that's coming out next year.
Yeah.
I had the general, like I had like a paragraph pitch that I had given Tor when we sold the trilogy.
Yeah.
And I started looking at that in, let's say August. And it was probably December, January that I had like an outline that I was then willing to share with like my agent, get their feedback. And then I shared it with my editor, got her feedback. And then, you know, between everything else that was going on, this was right before the pandemic.
Who's your editor at Tor?
Melissa Singer.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So basically then I had to put it on the back burner for a little while. Like, you know how it is. Like you're selling book 1 to everybody. You're like editing book 2 and then like you're working on book 3. So then I actually got behind because I had to do more edits on book 2 than I wanted to, but I got behind where I wanted to be. So it was June of last year. I sat down to write the book and I finished it the 2nd or 3rd week in August. And it's 100
off, man.
I mean, it's 145,000 words, so it's not like super long, but
nonetheless, that is I know there are people who can do that. I feel a mixture of admiration and marvel and loathing for all of you.
Yeah, but I mean, I'll say like the outlining process is the worst. It's like this case of I'll get a little bit and then like I'll just stop until like I hate myself enough that I go back to it and force myself to figure out what the next bit is.
But so you wrote the book in 2.5 months. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, very impressive. Very impressive.
No, thanks.
I'm gonna need another beer.
I'll pick up your tab. Just give me.
Thank you. Yes. Least you can do after making.
But you know, it's funny when you're talking about the special forces aspect that didn't work out, and you kind of had to go back. I tweeted out earlier today because I've been.
I just thought, but go ahead. Please go ahead.
Yeah, and what I love about the way that you're portraying like this, like kind of small arms, small teams tactics, are you have these people that are obviously incredibly competent. Like you go to great lengths to show like how like top notch these people are. They're like the 1% of the 1%, and yet every mission they're in goes to complete shit. And I love that because it's like real. I was in the infantry for 6 years. And, there's a reason why we try to keep missions as simple as possible because on paper it looks easy, but like the real world, there's a million variables from like wind to animals to people, which do all sorts of things, to equipment malfunctioning. And I think in fantasy, sometimes that gets lost. Like, and sometimes it is cool to see people just be really, really super competent, which you show. But I just love how like, they're like, this is the outcome we want. And inevitably, like almost every single time, they don't get that outcome. The one scene I was thinking of was with it's in book 2. Is it the Cattrall?
Yeah, the Cattrall, yeah.
The Cattrall. They're trying to ambush some of their own soldiers to get some intel on what's going on since they've been gone.
Yeah.
And they come up with this like awesome complex ambush, but then instead of 2 folks, it's 4. Instead of like, just like smacking the guy in the side of the head, he accidentally crushes his windpipe, somebody gets away, and suddenly they've killed half of them, wounded the others, and then they have to like make them all go away. And they're all just like looking at each other like, how do we fuck this up? And that to me is the most real experience of like when you're trying to do like missions in a combat zone. It's like you plan, and if it's boring, it went well, but most times like something's going to happen that's just going to throw a wrench in it. So I don't know, like, if that's super intentional on your part or if it's something that you're just naturally doing, but definitely love that aspect.
I don't know. It does my heart good to hear that rings true to you and that you have actual experience in that realm, because I don't. I'm just kind of, I read a lot of history and a lot of sort of armchair military history, but I don't, I haven't spent any time in the forces. So I always worry a little bit that like, am I getting it right? Am I doing justice to what the experience would be? And I get a lot of nice emails from folks who are overseas, serving in our military, and generally they're positive. But you just never know that whether you're like, just butchering it, or I mean, I don't know, but I think it's of a piece with trying to write fallible characters generally. You know, whether they're going to be fallible in a military situation or fallible in a political situation or an emotional situation. You know, I think that I do know, you know, I've lived enough life to see that not necessarily in the military, but generally our best laid schemes do not go the way that we want them to go in many realms, right? Whether it's, you know, whatever it is. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're totally right. I think that, you know, one, it's just as a reader or as a storyteller, right? It just sets up like great action because and fun and suspense because now they're in a worse spot. But yeah, no, I just love that. I'm a big fan of that kind of like small group of teammates that are like moving through together and like that team dynamic. And I think you balance it really well. Like there's no real stereotypes in that group. Like, you know, even is it Gwenna or Gwyneth?
Yeah. Well, Gwenna, I think, definitely starts out as a stereotype. I mean, but she
does until you put us in her POV, and then when we get to see like what's going on behind, then like she's no longer a stereotype. But it's not even like it's the brash person, but really on the inside they're afraid. It's not that. It's like she has real morals, she has real beliefs, and all of the stuff that she's been training for in that first series, like leading up to that moment. You know, it seems like she has to do the opposite, and she's faced with all these like moral quandaries and also physical quandaries that go against her nature. So, no, man, I think like that to me is also an awesome thing to see. So that, you know, I read your first book when it first came out, and then I don't know if you have this experience, but like as an author, like it's difficult for me to have the time and space to read somebody all the way through. I'll read like one book and then suddenly like I'm like, you know, in another series and I'm bouncing all over the place. And especially once you're published, then everybody's asking you to read like the next thing that won't come out for 3 years.
Right.
So I didn't get back to it until we set this up, which I'm glad we did. And then I was reading through that and then into the second one, and I'm about to jump into the third. And which you can spoil for me, it's okay. But please don't.
Everything. The third one is really mellow. People just kind of hang out on the beach. They have some conversations. There's a little argument over beers, and that's it.
They talk about what they just went through, and
it's just basically people saying, "Boy, that second book, that was a real that was tough." But now, thank God, we're past it. So you know, Gwenna, she was a character like. This is leading towards a question about your book, and the question is going to be, I mean, you've written the whole thing now. And so one of the things that I find having written a trilogy is that by the time you get to the third book, you're like, shit, I wish I had done something different in the first book. To like, once you really have the whole scope of it and you see how it's all going to coalesce, you're like, I could have set things up, or I really, you know, shot myself in the toe in that first book. And Gwenna was one of the characters who evolved in ways that I did not expect it. I mean, she was never going to be a POV character. And then I was like, well, I need somebody up there so we can kind of see what the hell's going on up there. And then I was like, oh, but she's actually an important character. And then, you know, she's now like the main character in the new book.
Yeah.
None of which I saw coming or planned for. Did you have experiences like that with your trilogy where by the time you got to like, let's say midway through the second or into the third book where you're like, I wish I had seen this coming. Sounds like you're an outliner, so maybe you don't have this problem in the way that I have it.
Well, I was going to say you're going to hate me.
Yeah, you don't have that problem. Yeah.
No. So I'm going to have that eventually, and that like terrifies me. But like for right now, like this one, because the acquisition process took forever for the trilogy, I was kind of just like churning for a little bit there. I was able to hammer out in a little more detail than I normally would, like what book 2 and 3 would look like.
Yeah.
And then when I went back and did another revised pass on the first book with my editor after they bought it, I was able to kind of foreshadow some stuff that I knew I wanted to include. And so I'm trying to think. I don't think I really got myself in any like jams or where I was like, man, I don't know how I'm gonna like write myself out of this, or like, why did you do that? Like now like, you can't do this cool thing. But it's definitely something that like the whole time I was writing it, I was waiting for it to happen. I was waiting for me to like turn the page and be like, oh no, in book 1 you did this and now you can't do what you were planning on. But I got lucky.
Oh, well, no, I don't. It does not sound like luck. It sounds like good planning. Yeah, I've had actually really good luck on Twitter because sometimes I like need to remember like some obscure detail from my first trilogy, and I'm like, there's no way to search for it. I'm not going to go read all those books again. So I'll just go on Twitter and say, hey, is anybody reading my first trilogy right now? And inevitably somebody's like, oh yeah, I just picked it up. And then I'm like, will you do me a huge favor and just look for like this one obscure detail? Like, does character A ever mention character B at any point? Like, are they aware of each other's existence? You know, something like that you can't really search for in any way. And I have to say, people have been, they have pulled my ass out of the fire many times by just like saying, yeah, sure, I'll look for that. Why not? So I see, I made the mistake of going over to the comments and I see Misty is saying, I guess the next book in Brian's series won't be out anytime soon. It's coming. It's coming. Yeah, I'm writing it right now. And I'm actually really excited about where it is, but, they're big. They're these big honking books. And so like The Empire's Ruin is 300,000 words or 305 or something. So, there's still things to be figured out with this second book. I mean, my background, you know, I wrote poetry. I did like my undergrad and grad school in poetry before I came to fantasy, and I wrote a ton of formal poetry. You know, I was interested in writing in, you know, conventional meters and trying out different, you know, working in conventional form, and so I'm sort of used to. In my mind, part of the writing process is like trying to meet sort of arbitrary demands that pre-exist, and that is just my experience of writing fantasy. Except the demands come from my own prior books, right? Like, you know, in a sonnet, you're trying to write 14 lines, whether it's Petrarchan, Shakespearean, whatever, and it's got a rhyme scheme. You got the meter, and so you're trying to work within all of these constraints. That's a certain kind of form. And, you know, in writing a fantasy trilogy, I just feel like the form that I'm struggling with is sort of self-imposed, but I've imposed certain things on myself by the creation of the world, by the nature of the magic system, by the nature of the theology, by the geography, by the political system. And so those become the formal constraints rather than rhyme scheme, rather than working in, you know, an 8-syllable line or a 10-syllable line or, you know, whatever it is. So it's actually, to me, it just feels like writing. But then I talk to someone like you who kind of has it all planned out, and I'm like, God, there are easier ways to do this.
Well, I mean, I think it's the same concept. It's just, again, it's like, where are you choosing to let that, you know, those constraints weigh on you? I'm just doing it in a different way at a different part of the process.
Sure. Right.
But I love the way that you're thinking about that. And that's kind of been, you know, I said that I was dreading finding that to happen, which is true. But I also, in the back of my mind, know that, like, I don't believe in writer's block. Knocking on all the wood now.
Yeah.
But I think it's just like, you know, it might take a little while to figure out what's the solution that's going to get you out of whatever hole you're in from all those different constraints that have piled up. Yeah. But when you do it, it's going to be awesome. The only thing you can't let yourself do is, like, you know, break all those just to get out of it, you know, no Deus.
Yeah.
But no, that's really interesting. So, you know, I was kind of curious, you know, your background said that you taught a variety of different areas.
Yeah, a bunch of stuff.
Has teaching influenced the way you approach writing at all, or not really? Were you writing when you were teaching?
Certainly the material that I taught has definitely, you know, so I taught, you know, comparative religion, world religion, philosophies of the world, English, you know, English literature, but also, you know, the art of translation, literature and translation. I mean, a bunch of different stuff. And all that is always present. Oh, actually, the translation thing. I have a question about your book, about the Latin in your book, which shows up in like chapter 2. But anyway, so all of that, yeah, it's all, I mean, I'm drawing on all that constantly all the time. I mean, teaching is a different thing. I loved the job. You know, I taught high school, and it was never boring. You walk into a room with 15 other people and you're going to talk about some stuff, and, you know, figuring out how to have a real conversation about a book or about the world or about any topic with 15 people, and to, you know, find a way to try and get all those voices out into the room in a way that's productive and not just cacophony. I loved that. I don't know if that skill really relates to writing or not. But it was a great job, and it gave me a chance to learn a bunch of shit that went in my books. So, but about, okay, so the Latin. So for people who haven't read Ryan's books, there's, you know, his books are written in English, which seems like a straightforward thing to say, but I actually think is like there's a whole vortex of like stuff you can think about there. But then he brings in Latin explicitly as, you know, one of the characters says, like, our company's motto, is it their motto? Yeah. Everything has a price. Omnia cum
parentio.
Parentio. Yeah. So everything has a price. And so talk to me about the choice to use not just one. I mean, you got to write the books in a language that people read. You can't write it in some like secret fantasy second world code. But then you brought in a second real world language. Talk to me about that.
So it's funny. You're the only person that, maybe the only person that's noticed, definitely the only person that's asked. And maybe it's just because where you stopped, but I'm glad you did, because I haven't ever had a chance to talk about this.
Yeah.
So that you're not going to find out a whole much more about that in the series, but the reason why I did that is, you know, I think what Buck says is it's like the only phrase in the new goddess Cirrus,
yes,
her language, that doesn't twist in her mouth.
And
basically,
so my interpretation is that the new goddess, her language is Latin. Is that correct?
So okay. Her language is Latin. We don't get to see a lot of that because her practitioners, you know, speak the vernacular of the day.
Sure. Okay.
But the whole reason for that was my way of potentially, because again, who knows? Readers only get to read as many books as publishers buy, but I have, you know, similar to Sanderson, although I don't know fully where he's going with this Cosmere, so I'm not going to say it's the same. But I have, you know, this idea.
You should just say you're part of the Cosmere.
I should say that Brandon and I have made a secret pact.
Brandon doesn't know, but I'm actually working in his world, in his universe. I'm sorry.
I've sliced in there. Yeah, that won't result in any lawsuits.
No. Fine.
Brandon, you have nothing to worry about. But no. So yeah. So basically, like, that's my way of hinting that there's some larger things. And you start to get a picture of that throughout the series.
Okay.
But there's a couple of different stories that I want to tell, and there's an overarching origin story lurking in the background. And so this is like, you know, the danger of fantasy is that, you know, I think especially the writers, we all love that iceberg that's kind of lurking.
Oh yeah.
And so, you know, readers, I think, love the iceberg when we show it to them in the right way. So, you know, there's some groundwork that's going to have to be laid before I could get to tell that origin story.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you don't notice it, that's fine. If you think, oh, well, you know, he's just showing that the new goddess has an alien language, that's fine.
Yeah.
If you take it a step further and ask some questions like you did, then, like, you know, that's kind of where that's lying, is that it's hinting at that there's more here. And
very cool.
This world is, you know, there's more going on than just this one planet, basically.
Yeah. Have you read The Steel Remains, that series by Richard Morgan?
Oh, I haven't. I've heard it.
I don't want to say too much about it, except that these issues arise and may be of interest to you.
Okay.
But here's coming back to language. I mean, one of the things, I'm curious how much you grapple with this. Obviously, our worlds, well, I don't know. My world, I think, is very clearly a secondary world. Mm-hmm. So the characters don't speak English, none of them. But I'm writing in English and I'm giving them language in English. So the whole book is translated, right? And there are some words that I find that are just part of the English vernacular that are too tied to our world. So if a character is really interested in something, I will never say they are riveted, because to me, you know, I know what a rivet is, and that implies a certain kind of technological device, and that doesn't exist in my world. And so I won't say it. Now, that's a little bit stupid because it's all translated, right? Riveted is just a translation of whatever imaginary language exists in this world. But I find some words, you know, I wouldn't use the word Spartan, for instance, like, you know, Spartan accommodations or something. Some words feel too tied to a certain place, time, and context in our world. Mm-hmm. I'm curious if you, my way into this was just thinking about that Latin phrase, and whether you grapple with that or you're just like, no, it's all just obviously a made up language. I'm fine with it.
Ask me on a different day, you'll get a different answer. But no, I think I do think about it. But the way I think about it is more like, what is the feel that I'm trying to give with this story? What is the feel from a time frame perspective, from a character perspective, and then trying to choose words that support that. So, for example, you know, there's a lot of what I would call, from an American perspective, Britishisms in the novel. Because it gives you kind of, hopefully, that sense of like Hornblower and like Pirates of the Caribbean.
It does, absolutely. That is effective. I can just say, just from the first chapters, absolutely.
Yeah, so like that's an example. You know, me trying to choose. So there's like specifically 4-ish main cultures in this world. There's like this Caribbean culture. There's a Mediterranean culture. There's a mishmash of like a South China, a Umayyad Empire. Kind of like, so like, you know, Muslim sort of North African versus like South China mashup culture. And then there's one that's kind of like I love France, but I'm a Francophile, but it's kind of like my like making fun of France, French culture. And so in each one of those, I'm trying to use words when I'm using you know, proper nouns and things like that. I'm trying to pick ones that support that feeling. That doesn't mean that, like, especially with Buck, it can be difficult because I'm writing in first person, which is a little unusual for fantasy. And, you know, she has such a smart mouth on her that it's really easy to slip into snark. And I'm okay with some snark, but I do have to be careful. Sometimes, like, you know, if I'm writing snarky, then like I'm going to be using more modern terminology. Sometimes I do have to like walk that back a little bit.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you talk about point of view, because the first maybe 4 chapters are first person, but then right before you know, and I was just reading today in preparation for this, but I hit a chapter that was in third person.
Yeah. So
what happens for the rest of the book? Like, how do you handle point of view over the course of the novel?
So in all the books, the majority of the points of view are from Buck, and those are in first person. It's her story. But whenever I'm switching point of view, you know, I don't recall ever reading it, but I'm sure it's been done. Maybe it's been done well. But I thought it'd be really confusing to have 4 or 5 different I POVs in the book. So whenever we switch to another,
it must exist somewhere, but I can't. Yeah, it's around. Yeah,
somebody has to have done it, but I know I've heard about it, but I wasn't interested in tackling that. So when we do switch POVs, 1, it's always for a purpose because there aren't that many. And 2, when I do that, I switch into third person. Now it's a close third person limited. So, you know, which I think most fantasy is these days.
Definitely.
Which I love because it's kind of cheating a little bit. It's really, really close to first, but you're still keeping that third, which I like. So you're not wrong. And thanks for pointing that out. There is a little bit of that in there, but the majority of it is from that first.
Well, I'm curious. So here's the thing. I mean, sometimes I struggle with, I have like certain pure ideas about purity. So it'd be very hard. Like actually in the book that I'm writing now, I was debating mixing up first and third person, and I'm like grappling with it. It seems like, just to me, I don't like it. It feels weird to me to do that. Was there ever any consideration of just going from Buck's POV straight up and not including the third, or?
Yeah, so I was thinking, well, 2 things, I guess. 1, I wrote 1 first-person POV book earlier that didn't get published, just to see if I could do it. And it was interesting. So I learned from that because I had always written third, always read third, and it was difficult at first. But then I kind of, you know, got excited by some of the stuff you can do that. I really like the way that then the narration becomes a voice in a way that it can't quite achieve in a third person POV.
Yeah, especially third person, that close psychological distance, that's hard. If you have more psychological distance, anyway. But yeah, go on.
Yeah, no, totally. Like if you're writing like second person or you're writing like third person omniscient, then like certainly you can. But like in the modern way of writing, it's difficult.
Right, yeah.
So when I wrote hers, her voice was just so strong in my head that I was like, I think I gotta write first person.
Yeah.
And it's funny because, you know, there was a couple of editors at other houses that were like, hey, you know, would you consider changing this all to third person because we think readers, you know, are more used to that and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, I'm not, you know, I'm not mercenary. Like I will like do something to make it more commercial and sellable.
But
like,
I don't think that's right. I mean, you know, I was just in a conversation with Christopher Buhlman, I don't know, 2 weeks ago, and his book is in first person.
Yep.
And that's what everybody loves about it.
Yep. Yeah. I get to read that one early on. It's a good one.
Yeah. So I don't, I mean.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's some things I'll compromise on. That was one where I was like, no, I think it'll be a betrayal to the character, to the voice, and ultimately to the story I'm trying to tell.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the only thing I would say is like, you know, you're a discovery writer, write a few chapters, like not just one. I think you got to write a few to get into that groove, but, you know, write a few. And like, I think you said earlier, you know, it didn't feel honest. If it feels honest, keep it. If it doesn't, then you got to answer.
Well, so I wrote, you know, my first trilogy is in third person, but then I wrote a standalone in first person.
Oh, is Skullsworn in first?
It's in first, yeah.
Oh, from her POV too. Okay.
From Peter's POV.
I'm excited.
Yeah, no, yeah. But what, you know, there were unexpected opportunities and challenges that came with first person. And one of the things that I hadn't grappled with until I was maybe a third of the way into the book is I was like, wait a minute. I need to know from what position, in what context is she telling this story and to whom? Before I can actually tell it effectively. And that really threw me for a loop because I was like, okay, I've got the voice is trundling along, this is fine. But then the way the story is told, once you're in first person, seems to me entirely contingent on audience and context. Are you you know, pleading your case in front of a court of law, or are you chatting with a friend over a beer? Or are you reminiscing on your deathbed? Or are you writing a memoir? You know, those are all going to affect, you know, the linguistic register in which the story is told. And they're also going to affect the distance between the protagonist who's experiencing the events and the protagonist who is relating the events. And, you know, the harmony between those two voices, I was like, I didn't anticipate any of this, but I was like, oh shit, this is like clearly very important. And so that I had to just like stop partway through and be like, okay, what am I doing? What actually am I doing here? How far removed is the narrator from the events that she's narrating? Because if it's a week, that's a very different book from a month, from a year, from 20 years, from 40 years, you know, and I don't know how much of that you have struggled with, or you just had it kind of diagrammed to begin with, or what?
Well, before I answer, what did you decide? What was she telling the story from? And
she's telling the story from a remove of about 10 years. And it's a kind of a spoiler to whom she's telling the story and in what context.
Okay.
Which isn't revealed actually until the epilogue.
Okay.
So I don't.
Yeah, I know, that's fine.
But once that clicked for me, which was maybe about halfway through writing the book, many other things about the voice and about the nature of the narration and what should be there and what didn't need to be there also clicked. You know, things that I've been bouncing off of, problems I've been running into, that I didn't think had anything to do with point of view or voice. Once I solved those kind of meta problems, it became very obvious how to handle some stuff. I was like, oh, well, because she's telling the story to this person, none of this shit matters. This person doesn't care about that. Right. And you know, so a whole bunch of chapters that I had, I was like, get rid of that. And I was like, but because she's telling the story to this person, you need to include all this other stuff that like in there yet. So that was a real eye opener for me, because I just kind of blundered my way into writing first. I just thought, oh, it'd be fun to write this one in first person. I mean, there was literally no more to it than that. Pierce seems like she'd have a fun voice. She's an assassin. She's the priestess of the god of death. And then I was like, oh, huh. There's more. Turns out this writing thing is kind of complicated.
Who knew?
Yeah, who knew? Who knew?
That's funny. I mean, I admire that. I have a more selfish answer in that, you know, I think a lot of authors talk about writing for like an audience of one. I don't know how you feel about that.
I'm not good.
Well, the way I think about it is, you know, I've heard somebody say that like the first draft is you telling yourself the story. The second draft is you telling, you know, the reader the story. I kind of see it as, you know, the idea is what gets me excited. But then each of those drafts is me telling myself the story and telling you the story at the same time. And
yeah.
That might not seem like a significant difference, but when I was writing Buck's story, it always felt like my question to her was, you know, why you, the street rat girl who, you know, just learned how to read and happens to be like an autodidact genius, but why are you going to take on the gods? Like, why do you think you can do that? And like, you know, basically like, prove it to me. Like, I don't believe you.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I think like the way I begin and end each book in the first couple of paragraphs is her talking directly to me and directly to you.
Yeah, that's neat. Yeah.
It's, you know, here's who I am. And then at the end of the book, it's here's why I'm doing what I'm doing. And here's what I'm going to do next. And then like, the next book, you know, picks up from there.
Well, and to my mind, you can tell me if this is off base, but that sounds to me as though the character is talking to posterity. Like they're, you know, talking to the author. It seems to me like talking to posterity in that they are telling the world their story, kind of. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Which is a type of first person narration. Obviously, that's like, I mean, your book doesn't read like a memoir, but that is the like. Let me tell you about the experiences I had and the reasons I made the decisions that I made. And the you is a generalized you. I want, and I don't understand. You know, it's clear that the scope of this story is going to be very large. So then it becomes appropriate to have kind of a generalized you who might be interested in the events that took place around, you know, whatever this is going to be, the War of the Gods, or, you know, however it comes. What's the name of the trilogy?
It's the Fall of the Gods series. I went with series because I wasn't sure if I was going to tell it in 3 books or more, and then I wasn't sure if I was going to come back. So I went with that. And I think you went with something similar too. Isn't yours series, or does it say
mine is the Chronicle? The Chronicle.
That's right.
Yeah. We went around the block with that. I'm horrible with titles. I'm pleased with it. I think it's good. I think I've only come up with the title for one of my books. One. Yeah, just The Last Mortal Bond. That was me.
Well, that's a good one.
All the other ones were either my agent, editor, other people. I'm just not good at it. Did you come up with all your titles, or?
Well, so the original title was Black Flag Shadow, and then my agent felt like that was too piratey, and which there's a ton of pirates in it, and then Tor ended up marketing it heavy towards the pirate side, so it was funny. But so no, we brainstormed together. I just threw a bunch of different. Basically, my process is I throw a bunch of words that sound cool that
exactly
the story, and then I just keep going.
Yes.
But I locked myself in with the second book. That there's, you know, each title is basically the blank, either the blank in the blank or the blank in. I cheated on the second book. The second book is just The Justice and Revenge, but the third book is The Memory and the Blood, and that was a hard one to name. So I guess if I did lock myself in anywhere, it was that.
I think those are good titles, though. Yeah.
I mean, I think they all tie back to the book when you finish it, like that you understand what each one of those words means and why it was included. So I think like that's kind of cool. Hopefully like a little Easter egg for the readers.
Well, I can go back in whenever we decide on the title of the book. I'm like, I can work with that title. Just give me 5 minutes and then I'll put it in the book. I'll go back and rewrite a chapter so that you know, the language is appropriate. Not that the actual title appears, but the language is appropriate. That the words that appear,
nice.
you know. But it's always been sort of like this retroactive thing where now we have the title, and I'm like, yeah, I know where that can go. That because you know the title is appropriate, even though I didn't come up with it. So
totally,
it's never just right there.
You know, I'm glad to hear that you're expanding in that world, because, you know, 3/4 of the way through book 2, and I don't want to spoil too much, but you talk about, you have one of these, you know, ancient beings talk about the young gods and like what happened when they came down.
Yeah.
And I'm like, so again, lover of history, I think most fantasy readers are.
Sure.
I'm like, oh my God. So I'm like, okay, so you've named like a dozen at least gods. Now you've dropped this. And I'm like, there's only like a book and a half left, less than that. I was like, there's no way he's covering all this, and I need to know more. So I'm glad you're doing that. Do you have this all, like all the gods and the religions? And
yeah. Not all that. Yeah. I'm not good planning out plot, but I am good planning out worlds and and theology and, you know, all of that stuff. That was actually kind of my way into the book, was thinking about the pantheon and the gods and the theology and, you know, all this stuff. So yeah. So I have a lot of material on that.
No, you do. You know, I think there's some obvious comparisons to some of the religious aspects to like Buddhism, as far as like, you know, the mental aspect of you know, trying to achieve oneness and things like that. And, you know, as someone who is very interested in secular Buddhism, I was really intrigued by that. But are there, and you know, there is a pantheon here. Is there anything, were there other religions that you were drawing upon, or other ideals that like you wanted to bring into the world that like helped shape what you ultimately kind of came up with?
Yeah. So, I mean, yes to all of it. I mean, I like, you know, as I was saying earlier, I used to teach a course on world religion. So there's stuff from all of that spread through. Everything from actually kind of shaping the pantheon, then to, you know, the Shin monks are, you know, heavily reliant on certain varieties of Buddhism and also kind of philosophical Taoism. But then, you know, the struggle, like back in the capital, the struggle between church and state is, you know, that's not reliant on any particular religious tradition necessarily, although there are certain places in the world where you can, you know, you can see that happening. But just that idea that like there are these rival power structures, and the state has a certain kind of power, but the church has a different kind of power. And, you know, so that clash was interesting to me. And then there are some of the gods, you know, the goddess of love, her adherents really kind of tend towards certain versions of Christianity. So I'm like kind of working, I'm just pulling from all this stuff. But the thing is really fun to me is working in a world where the characters are never sure of their religious belief. There are no moments, or well, no, there are some moments, but the moments are few when the gods actually show up and are incarnate. So, you know, Adair, if you're halfway through book 2, you've seen this. She has a moment, kind of a religious moment, where she's struck by lightning, and she doesn't know, nobody knows whether that means she's struck by lightning and survives. Does that mean that she is a prophet of the goddess of light, which she's always claimed to be descended from? Or is that just like a random accident and bullshit? And I'm attracted to the idea that people in our world, people of faith, have to grapple with these questions. You know, no matter how strong your faith is, there's going to be moments of doubt and moments of curiosity and moments of uncertainty, because, you know, for the most part, whatever gods you believe in, they don't come down and hang out with you and drink a beer. And so I enjoy exploring that in my world. The characters who are religious, and there's a lot of characters who are religious, but different religions, they're never quite sure. And they're always like, is it all bullshit? Like, you know, like I feel a power to this. I feel an affinity to this faith, and I feel like it brings meaning to my life and purpose. But am I wrong? You know, and that's a thread that I think is woven through all of the books, regardless of who the characters are and what gods they worship. And some of them are wrong, and some of them are less wrong. And I mean, I kind of know because I know what the deal is with the gods, but
right,
the characters don't. I don't know. I've only like touched on the gods in your world a little bit, but I'm already intrigued that the one god, like the whole city is built around the skeleton of the dead god.
Yeah.
That's rad. Like, what's the deal? Like, talk to me a little bit about gods and religion in your world.
Yeah, yeah. So there's basically two sects. There was one for the majority of the history of the world was the dead gods.
Okay, yeah.
Their skeletons are in the world. One of the capital cities is actually built, like you said, within the skeleton of one of them. So they know that these
super cool.
Yeah, like these god creatures existed. And the priests, the mages, use basically their blood and bone from these dead gods for different magic. And so it's a blood-based magic, and they have kind of two different schools. One is basically, they're called Venificus, which again is kind of a bastardization of a Latin terminology. But basically, they can, combine animal DNA with god DNA. And then when they ingest it, it transforms them into like a were creature. Yeah. So they're super obvious, and so they're rarely seen because of that. And then there's these dead walkers who basically can use and I love to blend science and fantasy. They basically use a construct in a book to command the undead. And so they were the only ones forever. And then the new goddess Ceres appears on the scene after a year, like 10 years of where all these volcanoes had exploded, covered the world in ash. A lot of people died. This new goddess appears. Turns out that like she's the ancient enemy of these dead gods.
Okay.
And nobody can see her, nobody can touch her, but except for her mages, and her mages have mind magic. They're called sin eaters.
Yeah, I saw. Yeah.
And it's not a spoiler, but basically shards of her sin are within these people, and so they can move incredibly fast. They have basically magic from her that allows them to manipulate their DNA so that like they can run really fast, but then like they're going to shed an enormous amount of heat. So like if they're not drinking enough water, if they're not eating enough, and they do this, like they could die, that sort of a thing. Yeah. But they can also communicate.
They're telepathic, right?
They're telepathic with each other, so they can communicate over long distances. So the trading company loves to use them because now they can find out what's going on.
I suspected it was something like that. So sin eaters, I've encountered that idea, and like it exists in our history in different places. How much of that were you drawing? There's like kind of like the British Isles sin eaters idea, and there's the Mesoamerican kind of Aztec sin eaters, and then like how much of that were you?
It was kind of the British side. There's a movie with Heath Ledger, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's about sin eating, and that was the first time I had encountered it.
It's a wild idea.
It's a wild idea. Yeah. I was raised in a very conservative evangelical Protestant community. Never came into contact with Catholicism really until I got to college, and then I took a bunch of history of Christianity courses, and so like this whole concept was completely foreign to me. So when I saw it, I was super intrigued, and then that was kind of the kernel of the idea. And then like it just sounds cool, right? Like sin eater, like that just sounds awesome.
Oh yeah. Totally. No, it's like immediately intriguing, and I'm excited to move on with the book and read more stuff, find out. I like it that there's like 3 pages of maps at the start.
I did all those. Now I didn't. Nice. They commissioned them, but they're very close to like what I sent over. So I'm actually pretty proud of those.
Yeah,
I love a good map.
Yeah,
and the comments are right. That movie was called The Order. It's a good movie.
Oh, cool. Yeah. No, I'll check it out.
So do you know what the title of the next book is, or is that TV?
I do, but I think I think that I came up with that one. Yeah, that one was mine. Small Victories. But we'll do probably a title and a cover reveal
for sure
when the time comes. Gotta keep it slightly under wraps. So it'll be out next year. But
nice.
Yeah, just trying to work my way through it. Well, Ryan, I don't know. We've been going for 65 minutes. I think that.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's been an awesome conversation. Hey, Candace, how are you?
Hey, this has been amazing. Thank y'all so much. And I mean, even folks are posting about it in the comments as well, about how like we have some writers who are watching who are newish to world building, and who have been really enjoying listening to all of this. I've been super enjoying it as well. When y'all were talking about point of view, the book that came to my mind is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin.
Oh yeah,
that's sold from like 3 completely.
That's a masterclass.
I mean, that's the book where it just throws it down.
When you start with second person, and I was like, well, I don't see how this is going to work, and then it totally does. No, that's a master class in writing.
It really is
incredible.
That's
really. And so whenever anybody brings up like point of view or having multiple points of view in a book, I just immediately think of that book because it's just so good. And I don't expect any other book to do what she did necessarily. It was so good, but if I'm interested to see more books putting different.
Well, that book and Ancillary Justice, I think, were 2 very groundbreaking books in the genre in terms of point of view. Just having that that fragmented first person eye. I looked across the pond and I saw myself approaching. Like I've never seen any book where that sentence was even possible.
Right.
So, those 2 books are I think just radical. I mean, instant classics, both of them.
Yeah, totally agreed. But thank y'all so much. I have a quick question. Do y'all have like world building Bibles?
Ryan?
I have so I use Word docs for everything, unfortunately. I don't have something cool in Scrivener, but so I do have basically one huge file that is like that I can like do a quick search through. That it does have a world building Bible. It's big. It's not like Brandon Sanderson World Bible. I've seen and listened to him talk about some of his. It's not that level, but it's there.
And I work in Scrivener, but I have I mean, different documents for all kinds of stuff. The history of this city, the politics of this city, the economic system, how it evolved, all this shit. But it will not surprise you if you've been listening to the whole conversation. It's not well organized. I'm always like, I know that I have, 10,000 words on this subject somewhere. Where the fuck is that?
That's why it's in one file and I Control F. And I'm like, I know it has this word in it.
Yeah, I know. I was giving you shit, but now your system sounds way better than my system. I need to rethink. I need to look at myself again.
Just copy, paste, and compile it all to one place.
So maybe I should do it. Yeah, because I'm always like, I know. I wrote the entire history of this minor, monastic order somewhere. Somewhere. If I can only find it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I asked that question because you both sounded like you were planners when it comes to the world and the world building.
Yeah.
And so I always ask writers that because I'm like, do you have a Bible or do you just like fly by the seat of your pants? And some of them do. And I just don't understand like how you can create these big things and then remember all of that without having it somewhere.
No, people have better memories than I do.
But asking Twitter is great.
Yeah, I know. Twitter has saved my ass so many times where I'm like, anybody, please help. Please help. I can't read my own books. And I will not read them again.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much for this conversation. It was wonderful. And thank you to everyone for watching this conversation. Of course, we wouldn't be having these conversations if you didn't watch. And of course, we want you to buy books because that's why we're all here. So here are the covers of the 2 books, the newest ones. Well, The Empire's Ruin is the start of a new thing, right?
Yeah, it's the start of a new trilogy. New trilogy, same world. Yeah.
Same world. Yeah. And then The Justice and Revenge is the second book in Ryan's trilogy. And the first book, I think, just came out in paperback a few weeks ago.
Oh, nice. Perfect.
So get the first book in paperback and read all the books because, of course, we love those. And you can get them on our website, tummyandcoos.com. Go to this event. It's just Justice Empire, and you can buy the books there. And hopefully if you're watching this, you'll buy the books from us and not from somewhere else.
Not naming names. Not naming
names. But yes, thank you all so much for being here and having this conversation. And hopefully folks now will buy books if they haven't already. So
thank you, Candace. Thank you, Ryan. This is great. Just a super fun evening.
No, thank you both so much. This has been wonderful.
Awesome. Have a good evening, everyone.
Good night, everybody. Take care.